Good morning, everyone. I'm Ian Marquand. I want to welcome you to the 2012 edition of the annual Economic Outlook Seminar presented by the University of Montana's Bureau of Business and Economic Research. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the Provost of the University of Montana, Perry Brown.
Thank you, Ian. I know some of you are still trying to find your seats, so we'll just let you just keep doing that. Let me just welcome everybody on behalf of the University of Montana. We have been proud to be a sponsor of the Outlook Seminars for a long, long time. We're really proud of the work of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. They really help us understand what is happening now and help us get some clues that will allow us to think about what might happen in the future. Forecasting is one of those tough kinds of things. You're never right until after the events have happened. But the Bureau gives us some ideas about what we might be looking at, what we might think about, how we might position ourselves to be really engaged in growing this economy. Now, today's topic is an exciting one because we know that energy is a major issue for all of us, major issue in Montana, certainly, and we have great opportunities here in Montana that center around the development of the energy that we all need as a country. It's not just a topic that deals with the Bakken oil field, though that is an important part of the picture in Montana right now, but it deals with all of Montana and a lot of other opportunities that we have in the energy sector. In addition, of course, to focusing primarily on energy today, you're going to get a chance to hear about many other sectors of our economy and some of the important things that are happening within those sectors. So we're really happy that we have the opportunity to hear from a number of different experts about what is happening and what might then unfold over the next year in Montana. So anyway, I'm going to get off the stage. I just hope you have an enjoyable time today. I hope you have fun learning, and I think you're going to pick up a lot of information that ought to be helpful in your businesses and in your government. And as we move forward, I think we'll have some new ideas that come out of today and some nuances that will help us position ourselves to really capitalize on what's happening in the economy. So on behalf of the University of Montana, we are grateful that you are here to listen, to participate, and to share with others. Thank you very much.
We have a number of people and organizations to recognize this morning. First of all, our statewide sponsors, Northwestern Energy, Benefis Health System, and Pacific Steel and Recycling. Also, our local sponsor, First Interstate Bank. So give those folks a hand for making this all possible. Make sure I can see what I've written here. The president of First Interstate Bank from Missoula, Mike Hickey, is here. Mike, can you show us where you are? Right there, so thank you very much. Also, John Brower, the chairman of the board for the Missoula Area Chamber of Commerce, is here, and I understand you have a table of some special student guests, so where are you located in the room? Right back there, apparently. Okay, well, thank you very much for sponsoring that table. We also have some very important folks from the world of higher education. The Commissioner of Higher Education, Sheila Stearns, is with us. Sheila, where are you? Right back there. Great. Yeah, go ahead. And the newly selected Commissioner-to-be, Clayton Christian, right there, our soon-to-be Commissioner of Higher Education. We also have a couple of members of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research's Advisory Board, Chuck Rohde and Larry White. Where are you in the room? Oh, I see one hand go up there. Recognize those folks as well, thank you. And we have a couple of local broadcast sponsors, Missoula Community Access Television and the UM School of Business Administration. If you have not checked in at the table outside, please do so, especially if you are here and hoping to get some continuing education credit, particularly for these organizations: the Montana Society of CPAs, the Montana Board of Real Estate Appraisers, the Institute of Certified Management Accountants, the Society of American Foresters, the Montana Insurance Continuing Education Program, the HR Certification Institute, the Montana Board of Realty Regulation, the Montana Teacher Professional Renewal Program, and the Montana Board of Social Work Examiners and Professional Counselors. So if you are here and hoping to get those continuing ed credits, please make sure you register outside. 2012 is going to be an important year for energy. I will just point out that 100 years ago, in 1912, the Montana Power Company was formed. So we are celebrating, or at least observing, a century of that particular institution. I now want to introduce our keynote speaker. Energy is the theme of this year's Economic Outlook seminar, and we're very pleased to have with us today the administrator of Montana's Board of Oil and Gas Conservation, Mr. Tom Richmond. Tom?
I've been warned about the microphone, so you're going to have to be patient while I adjust it. There we go. Most of my PowerPoint slides are maps, and so I'm going to be a little laser pointer challenged here. I'm not going to run back there and point at things. So this will turn out to be a Montana geography lesson for many of you, because I'm going to have to describe which counties things are in. And I'd have to warn you ahead of time that my Montana geography is a little distorted. To me, northwest Montana is cut bank, okay? So, as long as you're warned. And here we go. Montana has a long history of oil and gas, and you know, we've seen a lot of booms and busts, and so people call what we have now an energy renaissance or an energy revolution. And some call it just a boom, or they call it the Bakken boom. We still get people that call it the Bacon boom. The other day I had a lady call, and she was interested in the Balkan boom, which I thought was interesting. If she wanted to talk about Bulgaria, she got really kind of the wrong office. But so whatever you call it, it's, of course, very important to the state, and especially now. Montana's earliest production technology or oil finding mechanism was probably the dirty tennis shoe method, and that is that most wells were drilled on seeps, or surface evidence of oil and gas, and Montana has a number of natural seeps of oil, mostly found by the Native Americans and pioneers, something to lubricate the wagon axles, I guess. There is still existing a well on the shores of Kintla Lake on the west side of Glacier Park. That was one of the very first ones drilled in the state before the turn of the last century. And then there was an active development on the other side of the park in the Swift Current Valley near the present location, the Mini Glacier Hotel. That was a surface seep, but the seep came up in a metal mine shaft at depth, so it wasn't on the surface. Eventually, the park was designated about, I think, 1910, and all of the metal mining and the oil and gas activity stopped. And a little while later, Lake Sherborne was built on the east side of the park, and that inundated Montana's first oil field, making it our first offshore oil field, I suppose. I don't really know if the wells were properly plugged before they were flooded or not. So, the first commercial production in Montana, though, was in Carbon County, and that's in southern Montana, not too far from Red Lodge, in the Elk Basin field, and that started producing in about 1915. And it still produces. It produces to this day. It's a very large field, is sort of typical of our geography. Most of it's in Wyoming, about 90% of it. But it is an asset in Montana, and an early producer and an important producer. is Montana's historical production going back to our earliest records about 1916 or so. Before there was a Board of Oil and Gas, there was a Montana Railroad Commission that regulated oil and gas in Montana. I'm not too sure how thoroughly they regulated it, but they at least kept track of where wells were and how much they produced. And eventually there got to be a Montana Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, which was formed as an independent agency, and then later on the Board of Oil and Gas after the 1972 Constitution. So most of the railroad agencies have gone away with the exception of Texas, which still has a railroad commission that regulates oil and gas but doesn't regulate railroads. I think they are about to change that, so that'll be something kind of interesting in Texas. But you can see some booms and busts on this production chart. You can see the big kind of pink-looking peak that sticks up there above everything else. That was the Bell Creek boom. That happened in about 1966 to 67. That's the year I went off to Montana Tech to get a degree in petroleum engineering. You can see 4 years later the Bell Creek bust. I went to work with the Board of Oil and Gas in 1982. You can see that that was kind of at the peak there of the Red River boom. You can see what happened after that. So the deal is, if you don't blame me for that downturn in the 80s, I won't take credit for the upturn in the 2000s, okay? The last peak on there is the Bakken, and it basically doubled the state's production in a very short period of time. The yellow slice in the middle is Williston Basin production, and the Williston Basin has produced oil in Montana since the early 1950s, and in North Dakota about the same time, about 1951, for the discovery wells in both states. Now, this has a little bit more current production information, and and the red line is the price. So you can see at the end of that chart, the most recent 6 months or so of production, the graph has started to level off. Every oil well declines from its initial production rate. That decline can change, and when it's plotted on a statewide chart like this, you kind of cut out some of the noise, but Montana's production declines naturally about 4 to 7% a year. And so when something happens that makes that curve go up, certainly, but even flatten, it's the addition of significant production over a relatively short period of time. I personally am amazed. There's about 5,000 producing oil wells in Montana, and it always surprises me how few really good wells it takes to make that graph change. And what's flattened it out in the last several months are new wells being drilled with newer technology in Montana's existing Bakken development, and some brand new wells in eastern Roosevelt County that have added significantly to the state's production. Okay, so the name of the revolution is kind of converted into shale plays, and so in Montana you can see the Bakken area on this. This is an EIA map, Energy Information Administration. The EIA is a treasure trove of information. You have to take your pick and shovel to find it. Sometimes it's kind of a website that has so much information it's hard to find what you want. It's there somewhere, but this is one of their publications, and you can see the Bakken. You can see something else in northwest Montana, okay? Remember, that's Cutbank. That's being called the Alberta Bakken, okay? So it's a little bit different beast. It's got the same name, it's about the same age, but it's a different depositional environment than the Williston Basin Bakken. And you can see a couple of other things that are of interest on here. We have a little production from the Niobrara, which in Montana actually isn't as shaly a formation as you might guess from the title of this map, but we do have some Niobrara production. We have a lot of interest in the Heath Shale in central Montana. that is also an oil shale. Now, you know, a shale oil is a real resource. Shale oil goes in the tank. Oil shale, on the other hand, is the energy of the future and always will be. So, you have to be around oil shale to understand that one. Oil shale is the stuff you have to dig up and cook. So why the interest in shale? And that brings with it the concept of a resource play or a continuous resource play. A play is some kind of petroleum activity, and it's usually associated around a particular basin or a particular formation or feature. So when we talk about a Bakken play, it's a petroleum province that has something going on. A lot of the plays in Montana, certainly with the Bakken back east and in Texas, have to do with shale. Shale is a source rock for oil and gas, and it is usually organic rich. It produces oil, and that oil typically in the past has migrated along with natural gas. You can see some arrows drawn here on a permeable layer above the shale depicted, and in that migration on the upper right-hand side of this, it shows a little bump there that's accumulating some oil or natural gas. That's a conventional trap, the kinds of things people have looked for in the past. People honestly haven't looked at the source rock as being a potential reservoir rock. So that's the revolution. And the technology that enables that revolution is horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, the two of them together. So you can see the concept of a resource or a continuous resource play is that it's everywhere. So the risk of a dry hole is minimized. Now, the model says that you might drill a poor well from time to time. But when you minimize risk, of course, you attract a lot more risk capital. And in fact, in our Bakken development, which we call the Cooley Field, out of 750 wells, there were only two dry holes drilled. So that's a pretty good model for a continuous resource play. Not everyone is quite as fortunate, of course. We have horizontal oil shale activity kind of scattered around the state. You can see the Bakken development mostly in Richland and Roosevelt County. There is some Bakken development in far northeast Montana in the Flat Lake Field, a little bit different accumulation there, but nevertheless successful. You can see the exploratory efforts in Glacier County in northwest Montana. And you can see the Heath shale activity there in central Montana. So far, the jury is out on the Heath production. Wells are being completed there. They're not particularly good wells. I think the technology probably has to catch up a little bit to the Heath. It had to be customized in the Bakken, so there's no reason to believe it doesn't have to be customized for the Heath. And the stuff happening in Glacier County is a real mix of different formations. The so-called Alberta Bakken, the Bakken in that part of the country we call Exshaw, or for a little further south, maybe Sappington. So, geologists name the rocks, and you have to pay attention to the name. They get really upset. It's like forgetting the names of their kids if you don't remember the names of the rocks. So, this is the technology that was used in the Cooley Field in Richland County, and you can see a single vertical well, and this one has two laterals, so it's a dual lateral well. We have existing in Cooley some wells with as many as 4 or 5 laterals. Some of them are coplanar, so they're drilled out of the side of an existing lateral. But this is the technology that was used. You can see there's some surface casing set, there's production casing set down through the bend. There's a hole milled in the side of the casing, and another lateral is drilled outside of that with a hanger. But you can see in the pay zone, in the middle Bakken dolomite, which is the horizontal section here, there is no casing, so it's open hole. So you have a dual lateral well, and when it's fracture stimulated, you can put a plug in the well on one leg and stimulate one side at a time, but you have a single stage frac. So it goes where it goes. You have some control over how you pump the frac, but you don't have a lot of control over where the stimulation actually occurs. So this technology worked, and it obviously worked very well on the Montana side of the Bakken, but when it got to North Dakota, it didn't work at all. And so this is the technology that got customized, I guess, for the North Dakota Bakken and is now coming back into Montana. You can still see the single vertical well in a lateral, but this vertical well is cased through the bend, but there's another string of steel casing that's run in the bottom in the what was the open hole section in the old technology now has a steel liner. And along the length of that liner, the little boxes that I hope you can see are called swell packers. And that's not because they're really neat packers, but they are really neat packers. But they swell up when they get wet. So they run this string of casing in there with the swell packers on it, and they need to wait from, say, 1 to 3 days till the packers swell. And when they swell up, they seal against the sides of the hole that you've drilled. And that allows you then to individually perforate and fracture stimulate each of those intervals along the length of the lateral. So those packers are from about 250 feet apart to maybe as much as 500 feet apart, and you can individually perforate and then fracture treat each one of those segments. When all is said and done, a fracture job in the Bakken costs about as much as it costs to drill the well. About $4 million to drill the well and about $4 million to frack the well. So we're up in the $8 million category for most of our producing Bakken wells. Now, fortunately in Montana, the older technology was a little cheaper, and a lot of our wells were drilled and completed for less than $2 million. So, but this method really does produce more oil, I think, over the long term, and it certainly produces it a lot quicker in the short term. So. These are the kind of spacing units that the Board of Oil and Gas is creating for Bakken. So this is a 2-section spacing unit, 1,280 acres. You can see the surface location of the well up on the north side of the spacing unit, and it's drilled to the south. The bottom hole location, the surface location are about 200 feet from the lines, and that makes that lateral about 10,000 feet long. So it's 9,000 feet down, approximately, on an average, and then 10,000 feet out, about 19,000 feet drilled. One of the subtle technology changes when I first started to work for the board in 1982, we had a Red River boom going on, and those wells are about 13,000 feet deep, vertical wells. It would take from 45 to 60 days to drill one of those wells. This technology is 19,000 feet drilled, and they're commonly drilled in less than 30 days and in as little as 23 days. And the change has been polycrystalline insert diamond bits that allow you to drill for a very long time without changing the bit. And a drilling rig, if the bit gets dull or worn out, you have to take all of the drill pipe out of the hole to take the bit off, put a new bit on, and run all the drill pipe back in the hole. And that takes a lot of time. With this technology, with the diamond bits, the bit stays in the hole pretty much for all the time the well is being drilled. So a subtle change, but an important economic change in drilling horizontal wells. Now this is something that engineers really like, and geologists like it a little bit too, but this is an electric well log. Actually, it's a radioactive well log, but in the middle, the green part is the middle Bakken, which in Montana is a dolomite, and then the two shales, the upper and lower shale, that form the source rock for the oil that got squeezed out. And you probably don't want to spend a lot of time looking at a well log. I get a lot of questions about groundwater protection and groundwater and fracking. Montana and every other oil-producing state that has a regulatory agency, and believe me now, that's everybody, requires surface casing to be set. And surface casing serves a number of purposes, but one of its purposes is to protect underground sources of drinking water. And in the Williston Basin, where most of our wells are being drilled and hydraulically fractured. Surface casing is required to be set below the Fox Hills sandstone, which is the lowest, the deepest aquifer in that basin. Aquifers below that contain salt water for the most part. So the casing is set and cemented back to surface. That's the cement sheath and the casing itself are 2 levels of protection for the drinking water. And importantly enough, of course, the surface casing is where you put your blowout preventer, so that's a safety device as well as a water protection device. This is another little treasure off of EIA's website, and it's an animated slide. You can watch it develop here. You can see the Elm Coulee development there in Montana growing in green, 2005, 2006, and then all of a sudden you'll start seeing a lot more activity in North Dakota. And there it goes. Now when that resets again, you'll see some Bakken development in North Dakota. That is the result of horizontal drilling in the Bakken, but those wells weren't fracture stimulated. And the Bakken is fractured naturally by itself, the shale, in what we call microfractures, very tiny fractures that are held open by the fluid pressure. So as the wells produce, fluid pressure is reduced and the fractures start to close. At the same time, oil reservoirs are saturated or undersaturated, meaning that most of the reservoirs in Montana are undersaturated. So all of the natural gas in the reservoir is fully dissolved in the oil. There's a place in the pressure regime called the bubble point where that changes, and then there is free gas in the reservoir. And so what happened here is as those fractures closed in the reservoir bubble point, gas is much more mobile in a formation than oil, and so all of those fine Bakken oil wells are now fine Bakken gas wells. And gas, of course, is worth substantially less than oil, so that's not necessarily a good deal. This is an industry map, and it shows some features in western North Dakota and eastern Montana. The dark gray is labeled as the mature Bakken, so it's thermally mature. You have a source rock that's an organic shale. It needs to be under substantial temperature and pressure for a long enough period of time to generate oil. If it's not in the oil window, it may be in the gas window, as a lot of gas shales are. Back east, the Marcellus, down in Texas, the Barnett. So that hydrocarbon was generated in a little different environment. You can see the large gray area of mature Bakken, so that's Bakken that's generated oil. You can see a gray area outside of that that's less mature, but they're labeling it, this is from the USGS actually, but an expulsion zone. So as oil is created in the Bakken, it overpressures the Bakken and eventually it gets pushed out into something else. Well, in this case, it got pushed out into itself. So you have a source rock that's creating oil and it's overpressured, so it's migrating into some of the less mature Bakken that's around it. The large black line at the diagonal there is the Brockton-Freud fault zone, so next time you want to take a little vacation over there in Freud, I was in Freud in November. It's a nice place. You can see the Brockton-Freud fault zone on the surface. You can't really see it driving. You really can't see it driving because there's too many people hauling things in big trucks, and you want to pay attention to where you're going. So if you had an opportunity to see it from the air, you could see it from the air. It's a very big, deep fault. Not an earthquake fault now. It's not active. It's frozen in place. But it probably is not a barrier to Bakken oil generation. It may be a barrier to this migration or expulsion. There are Bakken wells on the other side of that line. So we know that they are either something different or maybe that line isn't in quite the right place. But anyway, this is an industry interpretation of how the oil is migrating in that, at least in that part of the Williston Basin. I'm going to show you another one. This is a cross section that's very similar. It's an industry cross section that's actually based on the map I just showed you. So I get a lot of questions about how come there's so many wells being drilled in North Dakota and not so many in Montana. Remember, we had our Bakken boom, it starting in 2000 and lasting through about 2007 or 2008. Folks in North Dakota were saying the same thing. How come all the drilling rigs are in Montana, and when are we going to get one in North Dakota? So, you know, the shoe goes back and forth. But what's important to know here is that if you had a great big sack of money and you wanted to drill Bakken wells, you would probably go to where the Bakken is the thickest and where there's some extra pay zones. And so the stuff in yellow down at the bottom of that lower Bakken shale, that's the Sanish sand, and that happens to be something that Mother Nature didn't give Montana. It doesn't exist here. And below that, in the Three Forks Formation in North Dakota, that does appear to be a separate reservoir. There seems to be a pressure barrier between the lower shale and Three Forks, and that doesn't exist in Montana. Our Three Forks oil, if it has oil in it, is probably Bakken oil that got pushed there during maturity. The state line is about at the zero edge of the lower Bakken shale, so that's to the left of that cross section. This is not to say that Montana doesn't have a significant resource or that we will not benefit from Bakken development. We certainly will, but I think it does explain why people went to North Dakota first. There's another little wrinkle here. A lot of these leases, for whatever reason, are 3-year leases. They were in Montana too. 3 years is not a long time to prove up a lease when everybody else is trying to do the same thing. So industry has a tendency to stay in one place and develop their properties before they go looking for someplace else to drill. And so that is also part of the reason why it is so busy in North Dakota and not yet in Montana. I get questions about permitting. You know, a bureaucrat shouldn't show his permitting workload in public, but here I am. So what's changed here? The green is the oil permits at the bottom. If you take an eyeball average across the last, say, 5 or 6, 10, even 10 years, you'll see we're currently at about our average for oil permits. What's gone away is natural gas. The value of natural gas has dropped substantially, and that affects coal bed natural gas or coal bed methane, which is the stuff at the top of those graphs first, because it requires so much more infrastructure. Natural gas requires infrastructure to produce. Coal bed methane requires twice as much infrastructure because you have so much water to move with it. So it suffers first from the downturn in gas prices. But ordinarily in Montana, we would permit about 300 new gas wells each summer. It's oftentimes a summertime activity. In the places where gas exists, they still have winter, usually in droves. But that's pretty much gone away. $3 gas does that to us. This is oil production by county. There's no particular surprise here. Fallon County, there are 2 structural features in the Williston Basin, big structural features. One of them is the Nesson Anticline in North Dakota. It's kind of a north-south feature. And then the other one is the Cedar Creek Anticline in Montana, which is a northwest-southeast feature. Those are big oil fields. In the development in Fallon County, the Cedar Creek Anticline was discovered in the 50s and redeveloped with horizontal wells. So those are vertical wells that have been re-entered and then drilled horizontally. And the entire field has been redeveloped with horizontal wells. And so you can see kind of a lump in the middle that happened just about the same time the Bakken did, and that's due to the increase in production from horizontally recompleted vertical wells. The gas production looks very similar. Bakken produces a lot of natural gas, which has to be treated before it can be sold. You wouldn't want it in the house. It has a lot of liquids in it. And high BTU liquids, so the liquids are extracted from the oil well gas and sold separately, and the dry gas is sold into the residential and space heating and other markets for natural gas. You can see that gas production is a little more evenly distributed by county. Bighorn County down there at the bottom, that's almost exclusively coal bed natural gas. You can see in early time here, this goes back into the mid-'80s or so. At one time, the market for natural gas in Montana was us. If we didn't burn it, it didn't get used. So an awful lot of gas wells in Montana were shut in seasonally. Almost, in many cases, well over 3/4 of the wells were shut in the summertime for lack of demand. And of course that affects both the price as well as the production, and you can see that kind of sawtooth looking affair early on. About in the early 90s, a line was built from gas producing areas in northern Montana into Canada, so we shipped gas north from the Havre country to the Trans-Canada gas line, which then comes back into the Midwest market around Chicago, which is a much more stable market, and the prices reflect that stability. Of course, they also reflect the current price of gas, which is not good. But in my job, I complain about low prices and then go home and complain about high prices. So schizophrenia is me. Tax revenues are kind of a real good news part of this story. You can see where tax revenues are. Local share and state share are approximately the same. There's a little bit of difference in the rates. If you go back to 1999, which is on this chart, the total revenue collected from oil and gas taxes is almost $2 billion. And most of it in the last 6 or 7 years. So that's a pretty significant impact on the state budget, about $2 billion worth of tax revenue. There's a couple of things to say about that. Maybe this is an opportunity to talk about something a little bit different, but oil and gas activity in general has created a lot of interest in state leases, and so the state has benefited, and the Common School Trust has benefited from the enhanced activity in leasing. Now, I need to talk a little bit about leasing plays because sometimes they get a life of their own, and we see them springing up, and people call all the time, and have you ever heard of this or that oil company? And of course we haven't, because they're not oil companies. For the most part, they're brokers. And so when one of these things starts, you sometimes have a company that has its own landmen buying leases for the purposes of drilling wells, but once that gets out very far, then you have people starting to buy leases in order to sell leases to other people buying leases. And so you can get kind of an artificial thing going. Now, there's goods and bads to that. The bad thing is, I suppose, that you got people knocking on your door that you might not want in your house, wanting to buy a lease. The other thing to be said, though, is that of all of the leases sold, there's probably a very, very tiny percentage that ever have a well drilled on them. So these leasing plays can put an incredible amount of money in a local economy with basically no impact, because no oil workers show up, there's nobody to kidnap you. And that was a nasty thing to say, actually. I know a lot of people that work in the oil field, and they're all pretty good folks. And oftentimes, these days, if you have a commercial driver's license, you can make about $25 an hour in Williston. You might have to sleep in your truck, but you can do that. But those folks are all thoroughly tested for drugs and alcohol, and unfortunately what comes with them, of course, are the other parts of society that have a tendency to follow around. So there are certainly impacts to oil booms, but a leasing boom is something else. That's something that has oftentimes almost no impact, puts a lot of money in the economy, but has the downside of creating a lot of animosity sometimes in a community, because people start comparing what they got and what they didn't get with their neighbor, and that's always kind of bad. The industry as a whole, of course, has quite an economic impact on Montana, and about $9 billion, including refining, and about 4,600 employees. Our rig count is currently increasing. We had about 9 in December, mostly operating in Glacier County and then over in eastern Montana. And that's gone up to about 13 in January, and I expect that that's going to continue to go up. The thing to remember a little bit about that, put it in some perspective, we had 750 wells drilled in the Elm Coulee field with a rig count of about 25. So each one of those rigs can drill about 10 to 12 wells a year. So the rig count doesn't sound large, but the impact, of course, is pretty large. So there was something in the Billings Gazette, I think, this week that this magazine did exactly this same routine again. I think the rankings changed a little bit, but that's what we do to North Dakota, and of course they do it to us too. But the tax rate in Montana is substantially lower than Montana. Montana has a reputation as a high tax state, and it is not. It is competitive with its neighbors. We have an 18-month tax holiday on new horizontal wells, a 12-month tax holiday on new wells, and you can see how that compares with North Dakota. It's also competitive with Wyoming. So when we talk about ROC's regulations and taxes as being the three things that influence the development in the state, clearly ROCs are what brings you here. People don't look for resources if they don't think they're going to find them, but the tax climate and the regulation climate, of course, have that effect as a tiebreaker. So Montana is pretty, I think, competitive across the board. And you can see the counties. This is a little newer slide than it looks. It's actually 2011 data on here. So you can see the counties, the county share has generated an awful lot of revenue for the individual counties. And that is what I had to say. I would certainly stand for questions if we have time.
We may have time for a question. Anybody have a question for Tom?
Way in the back.
Oh, right there. Yes, sir.
Oh, Senator Erickson.
Hi, Tom. You talked about two technologies, a newer one with the casing packing, and you said that it was a more efficient technology. The question I have is, how much faster do you pump out with this new technology? And of course, what I'm worried about is the kind of tax holiday we give.
Sure. Most of the Bakken wells produce with okay, so I'm an engineer, so here we go. There are generally two kinds of ways that wells produce. One of them is an exponential decline, which is a straight line if you plotted it on semi-log paper, okay? So that's a constant rate of decline over time. Bakken wells generally decline hyperbolically. So they drop like a stone in early time, and then they flatten out later on. So these wells will produce their highest rate probably in the first 3 to 6 months of production. And then they will drop to a moderate level and stay at that level for a fairly extended period of time. So a hyperbolic well, a lot of these Bakken wells have an estimated life of 40 years, which is about probably at least 30% longer than people estimate the wells that decline exponentially. So you're right, a lot of the flush production comes off in early time. And then the thing levels out for a longer period of time, produces then for maybe as long as 40 years.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
I noticed you were following along in your books, and we thank the Bureau for making the PowerPoint books available. We'd also like to thank the Montana Chamber of Commerce for its support in making these books possible. And in probably another couple of weeks, all the PowerPoints that you do see up here and are represented here in black and white, you can get from the Bureau's website in full color. You may have heard, seen, noticed, or been aware that under Chinese tradition, we have entered a new year, another year of the dragon. A year of the dragon is, under Chinese tradition, represents wealth, power, great success, and spectacular failures. This is also not just a year of the dragon, but a year of the water dragon. And again, the Chinese tell us that the water dragon is a bit more moderate than its other brethren. It is a bit more perceptive and has a tendency more to look before it leaps. So we shall see what the year brings. I'm not aware that the Bureau actually uses astrology or signs of the zodiac in its predictions. Dartboards may come into play, but nonetheless, we have now our 2012 economic outlook, beginning with the Director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, Pat Barkey, who will give us the broad view of both world, national, and Montana, and he will be followed immediately by Director Emeritus Paul Polzin, who will take another look at Montana and a specific look at Missoula. Pat?
Okay. Thanks, Ian. Wow. They may call this the Great Recession, but I don't think too many people are going to call it a Great Recovery. It's been a little bit tough, and we call it a hesitant recovery because it hasn't been all good news. It's been a recovery that's been characterized by persistently weak consumer and business spending throughout the entire recovery period so far. And the slow growth that we're experiencing here in this country is not unique. As a matter of fact, as this recovery unfolds and as Europe hits a few weak points, they're looking to us as the growth that's going to help pull them out. So it's been both here and abroad. This recovery has continued to have unsolved problems. One of the unsolved problems is the housing bust. It's still here. We talked about it quite a bit in previous programs. It hasn't gone away yet. It's not worked out. And of course, now we have this problem with this currency abroad, the euro, which is under great pressure and really could possibly, I mean, when the euro goes, if it goes, it could happen in a couple weeks. But I don't think it's going to happen in a couple weeks, but when it does, it'll be quick. Because this recovery's been so slow, it's given us some problems. And these problems they're not solvable by an act of Congress or by a wave of any other wand. The two problems I can think of are the long-term unemployed. We have 3.5 million Americans right now who have been out of work for more than a year. And those are the ones that just say they're still looking. And also we have government debt. I mean, you can't solve government debt right away. And it might even get worse because revenues are so weak because the economy's not doing as well. If you look at consumer spending, it did take a hit in the recession. If you graph it beginning with 2007, it fell substantially. And there you see what looks to be pretty reasonable growth, although by historical standards not much. In fact, consumers are spending less of their income. If you look at their income over the same period, at some points, income was rising and spending was going down. We're saving more, all right? Savings rates were very, very low before the recession. Americans are saving more for a lot of reasons. Their assets took a hit and so forth. But you can see at the end of this graph, these lines are starting to converge again. And this is one reason why we think in our office that even though things are looking a little bit better the last month and a half or so, we're likely to see another fallback. We're likely to see another growth stall like we've seen the last 2 years because consumers are not going to be spending that high fraction of their income. They're saving more for quite a while. Businesses is even more dramatic. If you look at corporate profits, again, starting in 2008, just a quarter after the recession, obviously they took a big hit in the recession, and they've grown fairly strongly since. Pace of growth has slowed down a little bit. But profits are up, and that's good. But what are they doing with the money? Well, in some cases, they're hanging on to it. This is the red line is their cash reserves. If you notice, those cash reserves also took a hit in the recession. But now that's $1.3 trillion that U.S.-based corporations have in cash reserves at the moment. So that's only part of the story. The other part of the story is that corporations are spending money. They're not necessarily spending it in the U.S. And in fact, that is rational for them to do because markets abroad are growing more quickly. And in fact, the sources of those profits are increasingly abroad. If you look at this going all the way back to the late 40s, the percentage of profits that come from foreign, that have a foreign share, you can see that in 2008, 46% of profits came from abroad. So investing in where the return is just something that business people do. Speaking of overseas, with this recovery being so slow and putting so much pressure on deficits, on debt, as we've heard a lot in Europe and a little bit in this country, the question is how much borrowing capacity do countries have left? If this is indeed a hesitant recovery that doesn't kick into gear for quite a while, and we have this pressure on deficits, how much more can countries borrow? A consulting firm, economy.com, did an analysis based not only on countries' debt level, but also on their culture or their track record of paying back debt. Because let's face it, some countries take debt a little more seriously than others. And if you look at this, they did something called fiscal space. I'm allowed to use a little jargon, right? There's a lot of professors in this audience, I know. The fiscal space, meaning how much room do you have left on your country's credit card? So what the heck does this graph mean? Well, let's go all the way down to the bottom. Japan, no space left. All right. Their debt to GDP ratio is approaching 200%. Greece and Italy in the same boat. But as you go up the list, you see a list of countries, some of whom are in the news as being in trouble, that actually do have some more capacity to borrow based on an analysis of the cost of financing that debt and their willingness to pay it back. In the U.S., we have another 150% of GDP that we could borrow. Now, is that an applause line? Are the Republican candidates saying we should be doing that in debates? Probably not. But there is the capacity to do that if we need to do it. There's another way of looking at this, though, because there's so much talk about sovereign debt, countries who owe money and not being able to pay that back. And of course, when investors lose confidence in a country's ability to pay back, then if they want to buy new debt, they have to pay a very, very high interest rate. So the bond yields on these countries' debt, it can reach a tipping point. So if a country like Greece can only buy debt at 15 or 16%, that's onerous, that's very expensive, and of course they can't afford it. So this is a different way of looking at the health of these countries by looking at what you might call a survival 10-year bond rate. So the way to interpret these numbers is if the yield on these countries' bonds were to rise up or above the numbers shown on this graph, it would tip them into bankruptcy and default. So you can see Japan, again, zero. They're a special case because they owe their debt. Their debt is mostly domestically held. Greece is Greece is going to default. Even on their guaranteed bonds from the EU, their rates are higher than what you see there. On the other hand, the U.S. is about 8.5%, which is way, way north of where we are now. Well, let's turn to Montana. One of the big surprises for us in our office preparing this forecast was the dawning realization that 2011 wasn't so good. It wasn't so good based on where we thought it would be. We thought 2011 would be a year we saw faster growth, and we were wrong. And that's kind of humbling, but it's also educational. We need to figure out why we were wrong. Well, one thing we missed in our forecast was the return of inflation. Tax revenues are great. They're not corrected for inflation. When we look at growth, we're looking at real growth. And if you look at what happened to inflation over the last year and a half, you can see that largely because of increases in food and energy, but some other goods as well, prices got up by late fall to almost 4% above where they were before. Okay? That was quite a bit more inflation than we had seen in the past. In fact, had we been right about our inflation forecast and all the other numbers came in as they did, we would have seen about 1 percentage point more growth in the Montana economy. Now, there's more than that, though, because we were surprised, quite frankly, by the performance of some large and important sectors that we didn't get right, and usually they're not too hard to forecast. One of those is healthcare. If you look statewide at healthcare earnings corrected for inflation, and these is the wage and salaries paid to healthcare workers, it's a pretty steady growth. But look at it a little more closely. Put a trend line on it, and look at 2011. It's like, well, not quite on trend. In fact, it was about $200 million lower, as healthcare has been impacted by both the recession and the increased scrutiny and regulation. Another one is government. Now, in the case of government actually went in reverse. Okay, government has the same kind of growth as healthcare, maybe not exactly the same. 2011 was actually a year where inflation-corrected earnings fell, and that was another $300 million shortfall, or we didn't get right. So You put the two of them there, and that's $500 million of our error right there. But the third reason really needs a little bit more explanation, and that has to do with the national economy. There are a lot of people asking, why is the recovery so slow? Why? And of course, what some people mean is, who can we blame for that? And that's, of course, a very productive industry in our country. Economists are trying to scratch their heads and say why it is, and we take a slightly different approach. Of course, we use a graph. The business cycle economists have been looking at growth in the economy for quite a while. And if you look since the post-war period, and you were to graph the national economy measured by output, GDP, this is what it looks like. It's a nice trended line going up. In fact, you can put the trend right on it. All right. Now there's a trend line. And now, if you look a little more closely, you see, there's some periods where we're running above trend, and there's some times when we're running below trend. And of course, we notice those fluctuations a great deal. Let me blow those up for you on a graph like this. So now this is the deviation of output in the economy from trend. So when this thing is above zero, the economy is running hot, and when it's below zero, we're not. And of course, when it's below zero, that coincides with recessions. And the National Bureau of Economic Research has declared all these various recessions. Now, if you look at this a little more closely, and especially if you look at, for example, that one right about in the middle, which is the deepest one, which is the 80s, okay, there's a recession. Wow, we went way below trend, and then we went right back up. All right? In fact, if you look at most of these recessions, that's the pattern with a couple exceptions. And of course, the biggest exception is where we are right now, where we've fallen below trend, and we've kind of languished down there. We haven't had the make-up growth. Now, we're still growing. The economy is over the recession. The economy is growing. In fact, GDP today is as high as it was when the recession started. But that doesn't account for the trend. We haven't caught back up. And that's what's going on. And the reason why is because this particular recession is different than every other one on this graph. Because this recession was accompanied by a banking crisis and a financial panic. And those kinds of recessions have occurred in our nation's history. They've also occurred in other nations around the globe. And they're different because they're seismic. They spread out across the entire economy because they affect ordinary business transactions. In fact, if you go and you look through history, there are a number of historical events where these kinds of recessions have occurred. You notice there's a dot there in the U.S. That's 1929. That's the Great Depression. And there are ones in the U.S. before that. And so business cycle researchers have looked at all of these kinds of recessions, all right, not just ordinary recessions, but recessions with banking crises, and have done some work to say, okay, how long does it take an economy after one of these kinds of events to get back up to trend? And the answer is years. It takes years. In fact, there's evidence that suggests that the trend itself can be altered by these kinds of events. So this is an average, not just of the countries I showed you on the previous slide, but of about 60 countries in different years and their recovery. And it shows how long, starting the clock at 2007, how long all the way out to 2014 economic activity still below trend, growing, but not making up the difference between where it should be if the event hadn't happened. This band shows the range. So it's a lot of countries here. I have some better, some worse. So you can see all of them, it's not so good. I mean, it doesn't mean recession. That doesn't mean no growth. That just means we're not back up to where we should be. And of course, where's the U.S. right now? Well, we're pretty much right on track. Now, that's not pleasant news, but it should calibrate us a little bit. And that's why we think in 2012, we're likely to see growth dip occasionally, as well as have good optimistic times like we're having right now. So in summary, I don't think the U.S. is going to go into another recession. But, I don't foresee anything right now that would put us in a recession. We seem to be doing reasonably well out of the danger zone. Europe's already in a recession. If it's mild, it's probably not a big deal for us. If it's severe, it could be something else. Government cutbacks are there. I mean, there's the pressure on government revenues at all levels of government now remains significant, and it's not all bad news, though, because the recovery's been going on for quite a while, and there's some things consumers and businesses simply need. And you are seeing evidence of at least the capacity, not necessarily the willingness, but the capacity of consumers and businesses to spend. I don't know how many of you noticed Caterpillar's earnings were announced I believe, yesterday. Equipment sales are doing very, very well. Equipment's wearing out. Businesses have to replace their equipment. In the case of consumers, you've got car sales. So cars are wearing out. Used cars are very expensive. Not many new cars out there to compete with them. People are starting to buy more new cars. It's just not a broad-based recovery. I think on the global scene, you're going to see a cooling off for commodity and food prices. George Haynes will talk a little bit about that. And unfortunately, we're going to see higher unemployment rates persist, certainly higher than we'd like to see. Let's look at Montana now. In Montana, there are some things going right. And we just heard from one of them, and that's energy and natural resources. Energy and natural resources are doing very, very well. I think as long as commodity prices don't get too weaker, particularly on the metal side, I think things look reasonably good in that industry. I think the ag sector is doing quite well. It's another double-digit year, a double-digit growth for farm gross receipts. Some problems to worry about there, but prices are pretty good. This is good news. The labor market's getting better. There's fewer unemployed now in Montana. There's been an encouraging uptick in job growth. It's not much, but it's the right direction. And it's good news. And in Montana, our consumer confidence remains higher. We're a more optimistic state, but we're also a state that is doing better, quite frankly, than some areas of the country, particularly southeast. On the other side, though, we still have the housing bust, and we just continue to learn this lesson about how important housing is in our economy. But the housing bust is putting pressure on financial institutions, wood products industry, real estate leasing, commercial. I mean, it's pretty broad. It's in some places getting a little bit better, but not really. I mean, on the residential side, still a big overhang of foreclosed homes. Scott Rickard will talk about that. We continue to be concerned about how weak retail is in Montana, and I think that's impacting Missoula quite a bit. It's really not a lot of signs of life, quite disappointing, in fact. The government cutbacks are being felt. We see government cutbacks at the state and federal level in Montana, and it's not a problem, so to speak, but it's a headwind. It's something we have to overcome if we're going to grow in total. And of course, here in Missoula as elsewhere, the wood product cutbacks, we're not seeing any fresh ones, but they're still reverberating. They're impacting the business plans and the business operations of all kinds of extra industries. When we look at the state economy and we look at the recent data, we're struck by how different growth is in different parts of the state. On this particular map here, if you're in the red, it means that your wage and salaries disbursements grew the fastest. In fact, you had to grow more than 4% to be in the red. And there's no urbans in the red. We got Shoto, and we got a few. But the blues are the next fastest, and that can be anywhere from 0.8 to 4. So you see Missoula and Yellowstone County show up there, as well as Gallatin County. The interesting thing, though, is that this really understates how much the East is booming, because it's true that you had to be 4% to get in the red, but I think Richland County made that with ease. Okay, they grew about 16%, and Fallon County about 12% growth, and that is not just in the last year. They've been growing like that for a couple years running now. So it's something that's new to us because we have so many rural areas growing very, very rapidly. Another thing we look at very closely when we come up with our forecast are commodity prices. And commodity prices, of course, are quite variable. This is as of December. I have a couple graphs here to show you, and you can think of them like the temperature gauge in your car, where all the way to the left is cold and up to the right is hot, and the current is displayed. And by cold, I mean 5-year low, and hot is a 5-year high. So in December, softwood lumber prices actually coming up a little bit, but still remaining pretty low. We don't see much happening on the construction in the state economy until at least 2013. Not really expecting to see, even when housing starts do pick up nationally, they're at such low levels, it's going to take a couple years of growth just to get beyond anything people would call depressed. On the farm side is mostly good news. You can see price for some of the important farm goods is running at least to the right of the scale, even wheat, even though that's not all the way up to the right. $7 wheat, as George Haynes will tell you, is really not too bad. And of course, that number's different today. It's different every day. On the metal side, copper prices have come back down a little bit, but they remain pretty high. The Chinese economy is starting to slow down a little bit. A couple of their manufacturing reports have shown stable or even declining manufacturing for the first time in quite a long time. Some of the metals prices have cooled off as well. And we think they're still high enough to support growth in our economy. And of course, you can see the price of oil. Getting to the forecast, we have always looked at a group of industries which we call basic industries to try to understand what the prospects are ahead for the state economy. Not every industry is on this list, but the industries which are drivers of the rest of the economy are. And for those of you with sharp eyes and good memories, you might notice that there's a new industry on this list, and that's energy. Energy does not exist as a government industry, as a classification, so we made it. So we put refining, we pulled it out of manufacturing, we put it in energy. We took oil production, pulled it out of mining. Okay, we took coal strip and we took it out of utilities, and we created something called energy, which we think is about 14% of the economy. And then you can see the other sectors: mining, which is now metal mining primarily, wood products, agriculture, travel and tourism, other manufacturing, transportation, the federal government. These are the areas where if we can predict what these industries are doing, the rest of the economy tends to follow. And our predictions for energy and natural resources, as I said, strong growth. Wood products, relatively flat. We're not seeing any good news ahead, but no more bad news. Agriculture, as George Haynes will say, is something which are reasonably good prospects. I mean, it's a good price environment. The pressure there is on prices from the demand side, which is much more stable than the fluctuations in supply as you have droughts and so forth. Travel and tourism has been a disappointment, quite frankly. Norma will talk a little bit about that. Norma's always upbeat, but the last few years, not as good as we thought it would be. Other manufacturing is quite mixed. It's quite varied. We're a little bit worried about some of the defense related cutbacks because there's a lot of defense contractors in Montana manufacturing. Transportation is doing better. Trucking and rail primarily. The goods economy is coming back. Durable goods sales are good, and you're seeing better improvement, more improvement there. On the federal side, the federal government is a big player in the Montana economy. And on the military side, of course, in some communities like Great Falls, where we were just the day before yesterday, we really don't know. We're worried about, every time the president comes out with a new defense strategy, that the people in Great Falls are paying attention. Those are at risk with budget sequestration and so forth. We're a little worried. Civilian employment, we're starting to call for now declines because they'll be very mild. We may not notice them, but the trajectory of the federal spending has changed. Quickly with the forecast, this is where we thought things were when I was here last year delivering a forecast. We thought we were out of the woods. 2009, negative year. 2010, we thought we'd grow by 0.9, and we said, things are getting better, we're going to grow 2.6 this year. What really happened? Well, we got some new data points. They changed the data on us a little bit, made 2010 actually look a little better, and now we're saying we're only going to come in at 0.7. So this is a hesitant recovery, not all continuous improvement, a real growth stall, if you will. Where do we think things are going? Well, we think with energy and ag really turning up the heat, we think that Montana will outperform the U.S. economy. Unfortunately, that says more about the U.S. economy than it does about Montana, because that 2 to 2.5% growth rate you can see in the out years is something that is quite a bit below what we experienced before the recession. There are a lot of risks to this forecast. One of the biggest risks is Europe. Europe? I mean, what? Europe? How does that matter? Well, the problem with Europe is that it's a financial situation. And that's revealed by this graph. It's interesting. I squeezed it into my presentation. It's an interesting graph because you can see what the euro did. These are the 10-year bond yields for all these various countries listed on the right. And you can see that before the euro was established, they were all over the place because investors faced risks that were different in each country. They faced an inflation risk and they faced default risk. All right? And so, of course, you needed more for Greek bonds than you needed for Germans. Then the euro came along. Wasn't that amazing? Look at that. Every single country, all the same. Inflation risk was gone. Greece can't inflate the euro. But then Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and people went, oh, but there could be a default, a new risk. And you can see how the spread has just returned. And that's putting huge pressure on that currency. If it's an ordinary recession in Europe, it might not matter. If you look at the countries that we ship our Montana products to, it's by and large Asia and Canada. There's certainly big numbers there to Europe, but they're dwarfed by the numbers going those other directions. So Europe not buying as much won't impact us collectively as much. But if it's a euro crisis, that's a whole nother can of beans. So with that, I'll stop and we'll hear from Paul Polson on what's going on here in Missoula and Ravalli.
We are now far enough into this recession that we can see some real differences between the communities in Montana. And it's not just in terms of the decline. We can now start to see and measure the recovery phase of the business cycle. Now, how do we measure recessions? Well, we use two metrics, amplitude and duration. Amplitude refers to how far did the economy decline, and duration is how many years, how long did the recession last. Now, we have got two cities in Montana that were least impacted by this recession: Lewis and Clark County, Helena, and Cascade County, Great Falls. They're primarily government towns, and that tends to stabilize their impact. We've got two cities in Montana, two counties in Montana, where the recession clearly was the worst: Flathead County and Ravalli County. The recession is lasting 4 years in both those places, and we're looking at almost 10% declines, peak to trough. In between, we've got places like Yellowstone County, where the recession only lasted about 1 year, a decline about 1.5%, and the Butte-Anaconda area, 1 year of decline, less than 1%. Then we have Missoula County and Ravalli County. Here in Missoula County, the recession has been long, 3 to 4 years, depending on how the 2011 data comes in. But the decline has been relatively mild, about 5%. Gallatin County, on the other hand, Bozeman, had a short, sharp recession, only 2 years in duration, but the decline was almost 8%. Now, what makes the Missoula economy tick? Well, we've got a list of basic industries for the Missoula County, just like we have a list for the state of Montana. With the closures in the wood products industry, the largest single segment of the economic base here in Missoula County is now the University of Montana and other state government. We are a trade center for Western Montana, not only in terms of retail trade and services, but also in terms of medical care. These refer to the people who come into Missoula to shop, see a doctor or dentist, and do other businesses. The federal government is important. Wood products is less important than it once was. Transportation is primarily rail and trucking and non-resident travel. Now, what's our outlook for each of those industries? Construction. Construction is not a basic industry, but it was certainly one of the prime movers in the last recession. Nobody expects a recovery in construction soon. At best, that's going to occur in 2013. State government. Well, we're now in the third year of a pay freeze for state workers, but we are seeing some growth at the University of Montana, primarily as a result of funded research. The trade center are relatively slow growing. Why is that? Well, the economy in the rural areas is relatively slow growing, and I think nobody really knows what's going to happen in healthcare. As Pat said, we look for stability at best in the federal government, perhaps some declines. The wood products industry is flat, but at least the big declines are behind us. Transportation, we'll come back and talk about this in just a minute. We're looking for growth in transportation, primarily related to energy-related matters. Non-resident travel, as Norm will talk about in just a minute, hopefully some recovery. Now, how is this going to phase in, or how does this result in a forecast? There are those 4 straight years of decline in the Missoula economy. And you can see that the declines have somewhat moderated. We're going to have to wait and see what the final numbers show for 2011. But we are forecasting a return to more modest growth in the Missoula economy, around 1.5 to 2%. This is a little different than it was during the recession, but it's far less than was occurring before the recession began. Now, very quickly, let's look at Ravalli County. Ravalli County was one of the hardest hit by the recession, and we can see those significant declines in 2008, 2009. More modest declines in 2010 and 2011. We too, or if River Valley County too, is forecast to return or see some growth in the next several years. But again, this growth is going to be less than was occurring earlier. What's causing the turnaround in River Valley County? Primarily the turnaround in Missoula County, because much of the largest single basic industry in River Valley County are commuters who live in River Valley County but work in Missoula. How do the various cities compare? We're forecasting about 2.4% statewide growth. The fastest growing area is going to be, or we're forecasting is going to be Gallatin County. Missoula County and River Valley County are going to come in right at the statewide average. Notice over there at the left, Cascade and Lewis and Clark County are going to be growing relatively slow, again, because the outlook for government is for relatively slow growth. Now, the theme of our conference this year is Montana's energy future. Much of this energy is going to be mined or produced in rural eastern Montana. What does that have to do with us in urban western Montana? Well, the thing to keep in mind is that even though the mines and the oil wells are in rural eastern Montana, that energy has to be transported to the ultimate consumer using Montana's energy transportation system. That's how the energy development in eastern Montana is going to affect western Montana. And once we understand Montana's energy transportation system, we can also explain some very puzzling facts about Montana's energy industry. Let's start with coal. Montana has much more coal than Wyoming. But when we look at production, we see that there's much more production coming out of Wyoming than in Montana. Now, up until now, much of the discussion has been about taxes. That's taxes cause this big difference. Don't ever dismiss taxes as a motivator for human behavior. It is important. But I think there are some other things affecting the coal industry that affect the difference in production in Montana and Wyoming. Now, what is Montana, or what is all coal used for? Most coal. Most coal is used for electrical generation. And most coal is transported by train from the mine to the ultimate consumer. Here we have a map of the major rail lines in our part of the world. You can see the Montana coal fields, and you can also see the Wyoming coal fields. Where is most of the Powder River coal shipped to? Primarily to the Midwest and the South. Places like St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, and Houston. And you can see that the rail distance to those major cities in the Midwest and the South is shorter for Wyoming than it is for Montana. Now, there is some coal shipped to the northern Great Plains. And you can see for the northern Great Plains, the rail distances are shorter from Montana. So that's the major reason we have a difference in production, is that Wyoming's market area is much larger than Montana market area. That's the major reason causing the difference in production. Now, there is some coal shipped west, and Montana mines do produce most of that. That's history. What about the future of coal production? What about the future of coal production in the U.S.? Well, if we look at the U.S. demand for coal, we see that it has been stable or declining for the last couple of decades. But that's not true for Asia. Here we have the actual and projected coal demand for South Korea, India, and some other countries. You can see a definite upward trend in their coal demand. Now look what happens when we add China. Definite upward trend. And in fact, the projected increase between 2010 and 2035, the projected increase in the Asian demand for coal is more than double the current U.S. production of coal. That's why Governor Schweitzer goes to Asia and talks to them about coal. That's a very big market. Now, if this materializes, if this coal, Asian coal demand materializes, the most likely scenario is that coal will be shipped via rail to West Coast ports, put on boats, and taken over to Asia. Now, if this materializes, the transportation situation is just reversed. It's the Montana coal that is closer to the West Coast ports. Right now, the only coal port is in Vancouver, but they're also proposing coal ports near Seattle and also Portland. And mines like the Signal Peak mine near Roundup and the proposed Arch coal mine, I think, are looking directly at this Asian demand for Powder River coal. Let's turn to another energy source, oil. Here again, we got an apparent paradox. Montana produces about 25 million barrels of oil, but only about 6% of Montana production is actually refined in the state. For comparison, North Dakota produces about 100 million barrels. Our production has been stable or declining. North Dakota has been growing. Once again, maps help us to explain things. 36 of our 56 counties produce some oil, but most oil is produced in two major areas. The old traditional oil-producing areas along the High Line, that's the Cutbank, Shelby area, and along the North Dakota border. Now let's insert crude oil pipelines. Now, I'll tell you to begin with, these maps are not technically complete. There's always somebody that knows more about these pipelines than I do. But I think you can see the picture very quickly. And you can see or understand why so little Montana oil is processed in Montana. There simply is no pipeline that connects the eastern oil fields with the Billings refineries. And technically, that pipeline just south of Billings is two pipelines. And most of the crude that is processed in the Billings refineries either comes down from Canada or up from Wyoming. And that is the proposed Keystone XL pipeline. Now, there is another oil pipeline system in the state, and that's the products pipeline system. This pipeline system is designed to take the finished products that are refined in Billings and get them to the ultimate consumer. You can see one branch of that pipeline goes south towards Salt Lake, another goes east toward Fargo, and another goes west toward Washington. And there's also one smaller refinery you can see up there in Great Falls that hooks into that products pipeline system. Now we got one more energy transportation system. That's the 500 kilovolt transmission line connecting Colstrip with the West Coast. Now there are more, there's more to the electric transmission system than just this one line, but this is we have data on this one line. Pat and I did a project about a year ago where we estimated the taxes paid by that pipeline to the various counties in Montana. You can see that about $8.5 million were paid to the various counties, and you can see right here in Missoula County, we got about $500,000 in terms of property taxes from this energy transmission system, which is transporting energy produced in eastern Montana to the consumer on the coast. Now, how do we put this together? How are the various parts of Montana affected by the eastern Montana energy? Here we have the counties which will be impacted by the western flow of coal. Here we have the counties that are impacted by either a crude oil pipeline or a products pipeline. And here we have the additional counties that are impacted by that 500 kilovolt transmission line. So you can see that 42 of Montana's 56 counties are directly or indirectly impacted by this energy that is being produced or mined in eastern Montana. Now with that, I'd like to end, and Pat and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Do we have a question? We have roving microphones that can find you. Boy, you guys were thorough.
We might say something else bad.
Somebody want to shout one out? Yes, sir.
This past year, we sent a fair amount of coal to China because Australia had big floods that shut down the Australian mines. To what extent did that cause a blip in the past year?
The question is, last year a lot of Montana coal went to China because the Australian mines were shut down by natural disaster, correct? And what was the impact of that?
The data, it's really hard to get data on Powder River coal going overseas. It appears that about 3 million tons was shipped out of Vancouver last year. Most of that probably went to Asia. So we're probably looking at maybe 3 million tons during 2010. Montana coal production is about 40 million tons. Wyoming's about 400 million tons. So you can see what the current effect is. But Arch is looking at a mine of about 30 million tons, and Signal Peak is looking at doubling their production to get them up to about 15 million tons. And that coal, they think that coal is headed for Asia.
Any other questions? Question is, what's the time frame, Paul, on your graphic about property tax impacts of the 500 kV line?
I think our actual estimating year was 2008, but that's annual payments. That's the amount paid each year to each of those counties by that particular transmission line.
And I see a hand in the back. We may be able to get a mic to you in just a moment here. In fact, Todd's walking there. Oh, maybe we got a couple there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the data on the coal mining production was interesting between Montana and Wyoming. And the suggestion, I guess, was that the sole differential between our production and Wyoming's is transportation costs and markets. Have you done any analysis on the cost of producing a ton of coal in Montana versus the cost of producing a ton of coal in Wyoming?
I have not done so, but I think you almost have to go mine by mine. I think there are a couple of those coal mines in Wyoming that have a very thick seam, and that would suggest that the cost per ton of extracting in Wyoming, and those mines in Wyoming. But I've also heard that the Decker mine has a very thick seam. So I think you have to go mine by mine on that rather than state by state.
And we have another question here.
With respect to the energy development plan for eastern Montana, can you speak to constraints with respect to a trained labor force?
Oh boy, that's exactly the case. You have all the stories about people from Flathead County finding jobs in Richland County. Yes, a trained, experienced labor force is a very real constraint. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Pat. Thank you, Paul. We're going to take about a 10-minute break now, and when we come back, we will start looking at individual sectors of the economy. Thank you very much.